Michael Myers is a bit of a weird one when it comes to killers in Dead by Daylight. He's infamous for how incredibly weak he is and pretty much always has been, yet the community had a lot of love for him despite all his flaws. If somebody would talk about how he needs buffs or changes, it was surprisingly common for people to interject, not with delusions of him being overpowered, but more of a, nah, that's just our weird Uncle Myers. He likes to eat 95 pallets every game and walk at survivors like a bot. Let him have his fun. Whether it's just because people couldn't imagine him any other way, or just out of respect for the fact that he is the reason DBD became the giant it is today, people just kind of accepted him for what he was. And while in more recent years, despite people being generally fond of him, people haven't really had anything positive to say about him. Before his rework, he was incredibly weak. In fact, people regularly discussed the possibility of him being the weakest killer in the game, while also having a very low skill ceiling due to his power consisting of look at people and walk at them. However, in the past, despite his shortcomings, there was one aspect of Myers that people were really happy with, and that was his add-on selection. That was because his add-ons were extremely versatile, just like today's sponsor, Red Magic, with their new flagship gaming powerhouse, the Red Magic 11 Pro. This gorgeous, completely flat design with no camera bumps and customizable RGB lights isn't all just looks though, as it's also launching with a brand new, industry-first technology, water cooling. That's right, this is the first mass-produced smartphone with water cooling, but that's also paired with Red Magic's waterproof fan and liquid metal for maximum cooling efficiency. What could possibly justify such insane cooling, you may ask? Well, inside this phone is a 144Hz AMOLED screen paired with a 7500 mAh battery running on a Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 running up to 4.6 GHz, or to put it simply, this thing is incredibly powerful. For starters, we're able to run COD Mobile at max graphics without breaking a sweat, with the built-in shoulder buttons making aiming and shooting a breeze. But of course, if that's not your cup of tea, Genshin Impact also runs absolutely immaculately, again smashing it with ease. And if we're talking mobile gaming on a Dead by Daylight channel, then it'd be unforgivable not to mention Identity V, which again runs flawlessly. And to top it off, I get insta-tunneled the moment I'm unhooked in my first match ever. War never changes, huh? But their innovation didn't stop at just the hardware level. This absolute beast also comes with Red Magic's game space, complete with various plugins to enhance your gaming experience, like superior image quality upscaling, footstep audio amplifications, and your very own personal assistant, Mora, able to provide game coaching or even just have a chat. There's a reason Red Magic's slogan is win more games. Check out the Red Magic 11 Pro now using the link in the description or pinned comment. Thank you so much to Red Magic for sponsoring this video. So what was so special about his add-ons being versatile? Well, just look at how boring and mundane other killers' add-ons were at the time. Like Billy's, where his add-ons just consisted of better turning, faster sprint speed, shorter collision stun, faster rev speed. It was just minor number adjustments to how the ability performs. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's very plain. Myers' add-ons, however, were much more experimental and offered pretty big changes to how he plays. This allowed him to stay fun and unique for the most part, but there was one add-on in particular that wasn't quite so unanimously loved, and that was Judith's Tombstone. Those of you who have played DBD before Myers got his rework will no doubt be very familiar with this add-on, but for those of you that don't play the game, Judith's Tombstone was an ultra rare add-on that, when equipped, would allow Michael Myers to straight up kill survivors in Tier 3 of Evil Within. No hitting and injuring, no slugging, no hooking. He could simply walk up to a survivor, grab them by the neck, and straight up kill them on the spot. Game over. Now, of course, that is absolutely game-changing, and at face value, incredibly next-level, absurd levels of OP, but luckily, there were downsides to it. The first of which was that it increased the amount of time to get to Evil Within 3 by an almighty 200%, straight up tripling how long it took. The other downside was that by equipping Judith's Tombstone, you'd have your movement speed permanently reduced by a whopping 9%. This meant that at the start of the game at Tier 1 of Evil Within, he'd be a measly 94.5% movement speed, which is straight up slower than the nurse and, in fact, slower than survivors. So this did indeed mean that it would have been physically impossible for him to catch up to survivors, as Bloodlust wasn't even a thing until 6 months after Myers was released. Of course, in Tier 2 and 3 it wouldn't be quite as bad, as with Tombstone he'd move at 106% movement speed, but that is still less than the Huntress at 110% movement speed. Now, of course, the player base found that absolutely crazy. There hadn't been anything like this at all so far, and just being able to skip over the main mechanic DBD is built around, hooking, is mind-blowing. So how was this considered okay? Well, initially, the biggest factor was genuinely the rarity of the item. Judith's Tombstone was ultra rare, and back in those days the Bloodpoint economy was way more grindy than what we're used to these days. So this, paired with the fact that the game was originally meant to be more of a fun be in a horror film experience instead of a perfectly balanced multiplayer game, meant that not just Judith's Tombstone, but ultra rare items in general were just balls to the walls insane. A prime example of this were old ebony memento moris, which would allow killers to immediately mori all 4 survivors the very first time they got downed with no hooks required. Like, theoretically, you could have had a hillbilly with this offering spawn in at the very start of the match, immediately begin a chainsaw sprint and catch someone off guard who maybe didn't spawn in a good spot, instantly downing them, then instantly mori them, and have that survivor out of the game within a minute. So in that state of the game, it wasn't quite as outlandish as it may seem in our current landscape, but still, it undeniably had extremely explosive potential. But of course, those were the very early days of the game, and the player base as a whole was still nowhere near as good at the game as we are nowadays. Yet, that version of Judith's Tombstone managed to stay in the game up until just this year at the time of making this video, 2025. Were the devs just completely neglectful and allowed something so absurdly overpowered to run rampant for nearly an entire decade? I mean, the nerfs still exists, so it's not entirely out of the question. Surprisingly, no. There was more to the story, 2 of the main factors being the downsides attached to this add-on and the killer that it belonged to. Let's start with the most obviously crippling effect, that movement speed debuff. 9% is a huge amount of slowdown to be hit with, even just for a few seconds, but for the entire game? That's rough. To be honest, that would have made him straight up unplayable, plain and simple, but luckily there was a solution to this issue. Play with your food. A perk that belongs to Myers himself that would allow him to gain 5% bonus movement speed per stack with a maximum of 3 stacks. Now, while this did technically solve the issue, it was still a significant hindrance as you had to earn each of those stacks by finding your obsession, starting a chase with them, then losing the chase without downing the survivor, waiting for the perk's internal cooldown, then doing it all again 2 more times. This alone wastes a not insignificant amount of time, as the chase mechanic as a whole has always been notoriously buggy, particularly in those early days, so sometimes it wouldn't start even when it blatantly should have. Losing chase was also pretty buggy and inconsistent, with it sometimes continuing as if you're in active pursuit of the survivor when you haven't been anywhere near them in like 10 plus seconds, delaying the stack from being earned, plus the cooldown limiting how quickly you can build them up when everything's working perfectly, and the fact that there was no guarantee you'd be finding the obsession early on in the game. Meanwhile, you're managing all of that at a reduced movement speed on one of the weakest killers in the game. All of that time wasted was time where survivors were getting free gen pressure with minimal interruption. That being said, play with your food was pretty much the only solution to that problem, which otherwise rendered Tombstone Myers practically unplayable, so they would almost always be paired together. In the minds of lower skilled players, that was practically GG. He can insta-mori us with no hooks and he's not even slowed down anymore. That's hardly fair. But at higher tiered lobbies, in fact even mid-tier gameplay, there was an even bigger issue at hand. That triple stalk time. As time progressed, players got better, the game progressed faster, and gens definitely progressed faster. Hack got released and Ruin took over the meta, and while pallet looping had been established as the way to play the game long ago, players were still far from optimized and many survivors were unbelievably susceptible to mind games, so chases weren't the biggest issue, gen speeds were. While looping took some practice to get good at, everyone can do gens, and when the killer is faffing about playing hide and seek with play of your food at a 9% movement speed reduction, people are most definitely going to do some gens. But that's not entirely the fault of Judith's Tombstone. You see, for many years, one of the biggest issues Myers had was just how obnoxiously long it took to stalk people and level up Evil Within, aside from the fact that he had no actual power other than walking at you in a straight line. His base stalking speed was significantly slower in general and got even slower the further away the survivor was, so with Judith's tombstone tripling the amount of time it took to get to tier 3, it genuinely meant that against any vaguely competent survivors, the game would be practically over by the time that tombstone procs, and he'd be lucky to get one kill with it. Even with Ruin, which was pretty much the only slowdown option for a long time, good players realised that Judith's tombstone was really not that scary to play against. The fact that play with your food was absolutely required really didn't help either, as Myers couldn't afford to sacrifice one of his precious perk slots like that. Sure, in the early days where the meta was enduring, brutal strength and ruin, that 4th slot was somewhat of a flex pick, so putting play of your food there wasn't the worst thing in the world, but as more and more perks got added, and in particular more and more slowdown perks got added, he would feel the sting of that missing perk slot more and more. This led to a weird divide. To newer, less skilled players, Judith's tombstone was an unbelievably unfair add-on that made them feel as if he got to break all the rules of the game and just skip to the victory line. But to more experienced players, it really wasn't that scary at all. In fact, some people viewed it as slightly more of a hindrance than a help, which meant that this was an incredibly controversial add-on as people weren't in unanimous agreement about its strength. Funnily enough, throughout the years, most of the discussion remained laser focused on Judith's tombstone, despite the fact that there was actually a second, far better alternative, Tombstone Piece. This one was a very rare add-on instead of ultra rare, which allowed Myers to instantly mori somebody regardless of hooks, but with slightly different rules. The downside is that after killing a survivor, tier 3 would automatically end immediately, whereas Judith's tombstone would keep going on for the normal duration. However, to account for that, Tombstone Piece only increased the tier 3 stalk time to 250% instead of 300%, and also didn't have any movement speed penalty whatsoever. This was so much better than Judith's tombstone. The slightly faster stalk time was certainly nice, but the lack of a movement speed penalty was huge. It allowed him to do so much more at the start of the game, find survivors faster, start stalking sooner, scare survivors off gens a bit, whereas with Judith's tombstone, he'd be walking at a snail's pace until he eventually built up his play of your food stacks, which could take God knows how long. Speaking of play of your food, since his movement speed wasn't reduced, he didn't need that perk. So he was free to use that slot on something more important, like slowdown perks, helping to counteract the big issue of gen times versus stalk times just a bit more. The downside of losing tier 3 after each kill was nowhere near as impactful as you might assume, as generally speaking, you'll only be getting 1 kill per tier 3 even with regular tombstone, as everyone else will just hide as soon as you pop it and wait out the timer while you're locked in the mori animation. While again, there was a divide about the power of these add-ons, there was one thing that players of all skill levels could agree on. It felt incredibly frustrating for Myers to spot you for the very first time, instantly pop his 99% at tier 3, and instantly kill you due to your teammates feeding him insane amounts of stalk and as many play of your food stacks as he wants. You being punished for somebody else's misplays never feels good. However, as time progressed, both of the Tombstone add-ons would see their strength drop even further amongst mid-tier and above survivors as word started to spread about certain strategies that allowed the survivors to just straight up disable the effects of Tombstone. These tricks were in the game ever since Myers was introduced, but generally only the sweatiest players knew about them at first. But by around 2019, these tricks had become common knowledge. If the survivor was in some sort of action that made them grabbable, the grab would always take priority over the Tombstone mori. This meant things like hiding in lockers, vaulting, staying on a gen or totem, or going down with plot twist would just disable the prompt for Myers to kill you. The go-to tactic for most people was to hide in lockers, and they aren't exactly rare, but in the event that you weren't near one, you could just continue repairing the gen and you'd be fine. If he grabbed you, it would put you on his shoulder and he could either hook you or drop you, but there's no prompt to tombstone the slugged survivor. His other option would be to step back, start a lunge and just down you and leave you slugged, but again, untombstonable. And that's how the Tombstone add-ons would remain until an almighty half a decade later on the 19th of October 2021 in patch 5.3.0, where Judith's Tombstone would receive a little bit of love from the devs. Buff now only applies the 9% movement speed reduction while in tier 3 instead of all game long. While that change was certainly nice, Tombstone Piece was still the better option, but even that would still lose if survivors just did gens. However, the Tombstone family's big shakeup was still to come, as another 3 years later on the 28th of November 2024, in patch 8.4.0, Michael Myers would receive a round of fairly substantial buffs to making Tier 1 less of a detriment and to make stalking significantly less of a time waste. These changes had a big impact on how quickly he could tier up Evil Within, with it now being way faster than ever before. To compensate for these changes, Judith's Tombstone and Tombstone Piece both received nerfs by doubling their stalk time penalties. This meant that Judith's Tombstone now increased how long it took to reach Tier 3 of Evil Within by an almighty 400%, which translated to an almighty 5 times longer stalk time to enter Tier 3. Despite the compensation nerfs to the add-ons, I think this still worked out to a net positive compared to before, meaning that he could activate these add-ons faster than ever before. I say I think because this version of Myers, and therefore Tombstone, only lasted for 1 year, and in that year, I only tested it out a few times, only played against him a handful of times, and didn't really hear anybody talk about it. This is mainly because, overall, these buffs to Myers' kit did make tiering up much faster, but Myers was still awful as the benefits he got for those tier ups were still nothing special, so pretty much everyone wrote it off as he hadn't really changed places in the tier lists. So let me know in the comments below if you think that's about right, or if maybe it worked out to be exactly the same as before with those add-ons. And of course, as I just said, only a year later on the 23rd of September 2025, in patch 9.2.0, Myers received an actual rework, changing Evil Within from a tier ability to a stance switching ability, coming with an add-on pass where many add-ons would receive major changes to fit his new kit, including the Tombstone family. However, the Tombstone add-ons weren't completely nuked from existence. While both add-ons now have completely different effects unrelated to Morying survivors, the old effect has been made somewhat base kit, well, in spirit at least. They made it so that if Myers activates Evil Incarnate and comes across a survivor that's on death hook, he can Mori them as a nice flourish animation without any actual impact on the game, much like Pyramid Head can do with his power. While the Myers rework has been an absolute failure so far, the way that Myers' ability to Mori survivors is handled now is certainly less controversial, whether that's for better or for worse.